My name's Dan Snow and I want to tell you about History Hit TV. It's like the Netflix for history. Hundreds of exclusive documentaries and interviews with the world's best historians. We've got an exclusive offer available to fans of Timeline. If you go to History Hit TV, you can either follow the information below this video or just Google History Hit TV and use the code TIMELINE. You get a special introductory offer. Go and check it out. In the meantime, enjoy this video.
The glaciers of the Alps, icy giants and the vaults of history. They guard relics of the past. But as a result of climate change, the eternal ice is steadily melting and exposing objects that are simply unique. The traces of history are deep frozen and thus in remarkably good condition. They give researchers important clues about the past. Some finds bear witness to brutal battles, like those fought in the First World War on Europe's highest front, and to dramatic family misfortunes.
You never know from 1 minute to the next whether a shell is going to tear you apart. If that's God's will, it will happen. I hope and pray to the Lord that I will make it back to my loved ones safe and sound.
Words written in his diary on July the 4th, 1915 by soldier Karl Außerhofer in his mountain dugout. A century later, his great-granddaughter, Sigrid Vistala, is searching for traces that will tell her about her grandfather and everyday life at the front.
Even though I never knew him personally, I sometimes found it difficult to work through the experiences he described, because they were so horrific. He wrote, for example, of soldiers who committed suicide because they could no longer cope with the situation, and other comrades who died because they didn't have enough to eat. Conditions high up in the mountains were really terrible.
In 1914, the German Reich plunged the world into one of the bloodiest conflicts of modern times. The First World War was a static war. In the west, the Germans faced the British and French, while the foe to the east was Tsarist Russia. In 1915, Italy declared war on Austria-Hungary, which was allied with Germany. The front ran right through the Alps. Elite troops fought at an altitude of up to 4,000 meters. It was the first war in military history to take place in the mountains. A war of extremes, a bloody war of attrition. The strategy was that whoever controlled the heights also controlled the valleys. Around 180,000 soldiers died on this icy front. From 1915 to 1918, Karl Außerhofer fought for Austria-Hungary in the mountains.
What is interesting about this diary is that my great-grandfather was right at the bottom of the chain of command. He was just an ordinary soldier, so we get an insight into how an ordinary soldier experienced the war. He wrote every day about how he was feeling, first and foremost about his grievances. He says almost on a daily basis that very little worked the way it should have done.
The journal is a very special document. Basically, it was only officers who kept a diary. Sigrid Vistala's great-grandfather vividly portrayed the strains and stresses of everyday life at the front.
Many quarters were built where there was no access to water. So it all had to be carried up on mules. And as a rule, after making coffee or soup, there was no water left for personal hygiene. Apart from something to drink, he once wrote, you don't get any extra water. If it gets warmer, I'll wash myself with snow. Otherwise, I'll leave it for a week.
Karl Außerhofer was stationed in the Dolomites in various positions around a mountain called the Sechstner Rotwand. Sigrid Wisthaler and her team are on the way to the Elferscharte. As a child, she spent a lot of time in the mountains. A professional historian, up here she has often come across relics of the First World War. This route was already used by soldiers back in those days.
This route was a real challenge for the men. Firstly, because it is so steep, and secondly, because it could be seen by the enemy. So, the soldiers taking supplies to their positions also came under fire.
For that reason, the men climbed to a height of almost 3,000 meters only at night. At that time, the Elferscharte was of strategic importance. From up here, soldiers were able to see into 2 valleys and control them.
This is evidence that there was once a ladder here. It provided access to an observation post for monitoring the Italian positions on the Große Elferscharte.
On the other side, the Austria-Hungary troops cut a peephole into the rock in order to keep watch on their Italian enemies. Twelve men were on duty in this small cave for 3 weeks at a time.
The soldiers had bunk beds, a table for meals, and a stove. And that was about it. The caves were paneled to make the damp less noticeable. We have to imagine it being like a farmhouse parlor. But even so, many soldiers suffered from rheumatism. It was the most common complaint in the mountains. A soldier once wrote that there was only one room for the cook to stand. It was so cramped in the caves that all the other men had to lie on their beds. A tin can from Norway, the main supplier to the Austro-Hungarian forces.
Karl Außerhofer described the supply situation in September 1915.
The meals are getting worse and worse. There is a shortage of everything, yet the war still drags on. I've had stomachache for days now. You get meat that's tougher than the soles of your boots, and when supplies are scarce, I have to fast for days on end.
At an altitude of almost 3,000 meters, in the winter months especially, the weather was sometimes so bad that climbing was impossible. Nor could the material cableway be operated. The troops were then cut off from the outside world for days on end. It was more of a battle against nature than against the enemy, whose positions were only a few meters away. Under constant fire to protect themselves, the Austro-Hungarian troops cut a system of galleries into the rock. They worked round the clock, managing 1 meter every 3 days. This also created space for observation posts, machine guns, cannon and quarters.
This complex can be regarded as a technical masterpiece. Building a system of galleries at such an altitude was extremely difficult, especially in winter. Everything, every nail and every hammer had to be carried up. To make swift progress, the men worked round the clock. It's so exciting here, because even after 100 years, you can still come across interesting small finds.
Another interesting artifact. This spoon was discovered near the entrance. Its practical design means the spoon could have been hung up, and so the search for relics of the past continues. Personal effects, parts of a soldier's gear, ammunition. The team are looking for any traces in the gallery, which is a good 300 meters long. They have been given special permission for their search, but hikers have to hand in any relics of the past they come across. Another find, snow goggles. It's a model they haven't seen before.
Eine Schneebrille. So ein Modell haben wir noch keines.
The design is really interesting, very basic. I can imagine that the goggles were intended for a sentry who didn't have to move. After all, you can't see much through these slits. The wearer's vision was very limited.
The war in the mountains was a battle against the enemy and nature, but there was also conflict within the ranks, because the ordinary soldiers often suffered from the despotic behavior of their privileged officers. In September 1915, Ausserhofer wrote,
Last night, one member of our machine gun crew shot himself. It seems he couldn't stand the way he was being treated. He was a nice lad, a German, 20 years old at the most. He was buried this afternoon.
Karl Ausserhofer survived the war. He passed away in 1965. In October 1917, Austro-Hungarian forces advanced towards the Adriatic. The mountain war in the Dolomites was over. But in the west, fighting on an icy front over 600 kilometers long continued for one more year. On the Koenigspitze, for example, 3,851 meters above sea level, this was the second highest position in the First World War. A century later, a team of archaeologists and mountain rescuers are on their way to the summit.
The problem is that since there are no level areas up here, the helicopter can't land, so we have to jump out while it is hovering. This, of course, is only possible when the weather is good and there is little wind. It's a situation that really does call for experts.
One false step could prove fatal. There is a sheer drop of almost 600 meters. In 1917, Austro-Hungarian troops just managed to beat the Italians to occupying this strategically important position.
As a lookout post, it offers an outstanding view to the south. What is more, it was actually quite clear beforehand that whoever won the race for the Koenigspitze and became entrenched up here would be almost impossible to dislodge. The position served as an observation point for artillery commanders. There were also machine guns and a small cannon up here, but basically they were just used to cause problems for the enemy positions nearby.
As protection from the snow and ice, the Austro-Hungarian troops built a shelter that could house 16 men.
The situation with regard to this hut is truly unique. You won't find anything like it along the entire front. It's midday, and with the sun shining in, this stove is now fully exposed. We need to remove it as quickly as possible. You can see that the shingles are all loose, and the roofing paper behind them is also in a bad state. Down there on the corner below us, it's sticking right out.
In the First World War, the men up here had to hold out for 3 weeks. Only then were they relieved. And if the weather was bad, they had to stay for even longer. The team headed by archaeologist Rupert Gietel has discovered some old helmets. Located a short distance away is what used to be the toilet. There are still lots of newspapers and letters lying around. Sadly, the researchers cannot get into the hut itself.
This is solid ice. You can easily see all the horizontal layers. In the first few years, the roof wasn't yet leak-proof, and the water slowly seeped in, forming a small layer of ice every year. On the floor, you can make out furniture, stools and chairs. The ice is really clear, but still, you can only see about 20 centimeters into it.
A huge block of ice inside the hut, a time capsule. Using different methods, the researchers are trying to get into the hut. But there is a great risk of relics being damaged. The most promising method is a hot air blower, but it will take days for it to thaw everything.
Glacier retreat is most certainly a problem. The huts are being affected more and more by snowmelt, and at some point they'll plunge down into the valley. So we are also under a bit of time pressure to get things done in the near future.
But that won't be easy. Today, too, the team are frustrated by the weather. Towards midday, mist begins to waft in, forcing the men to stop work. The risk of the helicopter being unable to land is just too great.
Official conservationists have been trying to examine the hut since 2015, but we have always been foiled by the weather, and that in summer. We can't begin to imagine what everyday life was like for soldiers here at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters. The Italian positions were only around 250 meters away, so the men were effectively in a battle situation.
The legacy of those years can be seen at the Office for the Protection of Archaeological Monuments in Bolzano. Its director, Katrin Mazzoli, and head of excavations, Hubert Steiner, showed us some of the finds from the Koenigspitze. This 100-year-old helmet was punctured twice. Was a soldier wearing it when that happened?
It seems that helmets were also held high to determine where the enemy was located. That became clear when he opened fire.
But there are other helmets with bullet holes, so we don't know if someone was actually killed.
The latrine and its contents also provide the archaeologists with clues.
In the area around the toilet, we found some toilet paper. Most of it was newspaper. It's amazing that newspapers were taken up to the Koenigspitze to help the soldiers pass the time. At some time or other, the newspapers ended up in the toilet. This is the only example so far of an intact toilet with human excrement dating back to the First World War.
The excrement preserved by the ice could contain the original pathogens which caused Spanish flu. That would be a sensational find. It would enable scientists to learn more about the devastating epidemic. But the director of excavations hopes the deep-frozen interior of the hut will yield the most information.
The end of the First World War actually came as a surprise to the Austro-Hungarian troops. They withdrew from one day to the next. Basically, it was the officers who took to their heels first so as not to be taken prisoner. The men made off with nothing more than the clothes they were wearing. Since these positions were abandoned helter-skelter, it's possible that all the equipment inside is still intact, and the hut can be regarded as a kind of time capsule.
In the years ahead, the archaeologists hope to unearth more finds on the Koenigspitze. Glaciers are a perfect natural archive. In the eternal ice, organic materials remain preserved in their original state even if they emerge again much later. It is almost a miracle that archaeologists on the edge of a glacier find any relics at all, because the icy giants push their way down into the valley with enormous force. Only if something is lying protected in a depression is it preserved. Like at the Tiesenjoch, for example. It was here in September 1991, at an altitude of 3,000 meters, that hikers discovered the mortal remains of a human being, perfectly preserved by glacier ice. The findings of an examination carried out by Innsbruck University were a sensation. Scientists calculated that the iceman, now known as Ötzi, lived and died 5,300 years ago. Ötzi opened a door to the past which had previously been closed and made glacier archaeology popular. For a long time, just how Ötzi met his end in the mountains remained a mystery. In 2001, researchers performing a CT scan on the corpse discovered an arrowhead in the shoulder. The iceman, it seems, met a violent end. Climate change is causing the glaciers to melt relentlessly, and every year they expose new objects. In most cases, they are found by chance by hikers or by the operators of alpine huts. 8 years ago, at an altitude of 2,690 meters on the Lötschen Pass, the ice yielded some unique objects. Like these promising wood fragments from the Bronze Age. Searching nearby, glacier archaeologists then found a mysterious box around 4,500 years old. Since then, archaeologist Regula Gubler has been searching the pass every summer. If she finds other objects, she hopes she could sketch an overall picture of the archaeological site and thus also find out more about the mysterious box.
We don't know whether the snowfield has thawed completely. We search as a pair, because no one should be out and about in the mountains on their own. We can't say for certain that we'll find something. If something bigger has been exposed, we can always get more people to come up here.
The laborious ascent was probably no problem for the people who lived 4,500 years ago. Our ancestors spent their lives mainly outdoors. They were used to the physical effort of moving from one valley to another.
Things which have been found prove quite clearly that in the early Bronze Age there was contact between the Valais, the Bernese Oberland and Lakeland, and the Swiss Midlands. These glacier finds indicate certain routes. People used the Grimsel, Lötsche and Saanich passes and the Schniedejoch.
The glacier archaeologists are inspecting a snowfield where they discovered Bronze Age finds 7 years ago. Under the snow is a wind-protected depression where people possibly rested. The team are excited by what they have found.
Wunderbar. Damit abgeschnitten. Gut abgeschnitten. Beidseitig. Beidseitig, hä? Schön Stück.
At this altitude, 500 meters above the tree line, every piece of wood is interesting, because at some time it was brought up here by human hand. It is only thanks to the special conditions in the ice that the organic material was able to survive at all for thousands of years.
The finds could only survive so well for thousands of years because of the ice. Since there's no oxygen in ice, the material cannot decompose and actually looks as good as new. But if it lies on the surface for 2 or 3 years, it is ruined. So we have no time to lose.
That is why every year valuable artifacts are lost forever.
Everything is still there. Look.
The pieces of wood all seem to belong to a Bronze Age resting place. Will these new finds help to solve the mystery of the box?
In 2012, within the same 2 square meters, we found more arrowhead fragments, a bowstring, and a wooden splint box. A lot of equipment from the early Bronze Age. But the most important find is the splint box. It really does look like a modern-day splint box, round, with a wooden bottom and a wooden side that has been stitched on. We found it up here on the Lötschen Pass, lying upside down. With the remains of its contents, it was one black lump.
Since the contents of the box were mixed with earth, the scientists quickly dug up the whole block. Subsequent analysis in Bern has revealed food residues. So this is probably the oldest tucker box in the world. The researchers are continuing their search in the hope of finding the lid to the box.
If we knew what the lid looked like, we'd have the first Bronze Age wooden box. So far, we have found the bottom. and parts of the sides, but we don't know the exact height, nor do we know how the box was carried or sealed.
6 years after the box was found, restorer Johanna Klügel is carefully removing small stones and soil residues. But problems have cropped up.
In this area, we have organic fibers, raffia fibers, which run into the interior of the block. Naturally, I can only see the surface, but I would like to have the three-dimensional documentation of the structures in the interior.
Dokumentation der Strukturen auch im Inneren.
The material is too fragile for further examination, but a CT scan, it is hoped, will provide an insight into the interior. Johanna Klügel wants to know what the cord was for. Was it part of the lid, or did it perhaps even have a carrying function? At the Paul Scherer Institute near Zurich, she hopes to find answers. The prehistoric lump of earth is examined with a huge X-ray and neutron scanner. For 6 hours, it produces wafer-like images, which are then assembled to produce a 3D picture. The high-tech analysis is supplemented by another, totally different research method of experimental archaeology. Karl Bühler has specialized in the design of splint boxes and is regarded as a real master of his trade. He's come here for some shingles.
Wir können Schindli machen.
Ja, mal.
Da darf ich etwas rauslesen.
Ja.
At this mountain farmer's, Bühler finds the ideal material for reconstructing the tucker box. Thin shingles made of pine.
In the mountains, of course, you have mountain wood. Pine, fine-grained pine. It has to be linear, easy to bend, so it's not good if the wood is knotty or wavy.
To give the solid wood the required shape, Bühler works it until it is wafer thin. In order to provide the archaeologists with information on the construction of the box, he tries only to use primeval tools.
I was certainly motivated by the question of how people could have done all that over 4,000 years ago without the use of modern tools. Instead of clamping tongs and vices, we made brackets.
Making a copy is harder than expected. Bühler needs hot steam from a water boiler to bend the wood. He can't explain how people in the Bronze Age did it. He then gives the shingles the right shape with a leather strap.
I imagined that 4,000 years ago they must somehow have used a log as a mould. The thin part at the top, which has a broader diameter, is for the lid. As you can see, I'm using thin shingles.
Bühler suspects that the tucker box had a lid made of chipping. Because they are light, containers like this have been highly popular in the region for centuries. After nearly a year of preparation and a lot of fiddling, the replica of the 4,200-year-old box from the Lötschen Pass is ready.
I'm amazed. Craftsmanship in those days was superb. They could create beautiful vessels from solid wood. Fantastic.
Back to the Archaeological Service in Bern. 3 weeks after the CT scan, the 3D image of the contents of the tucker box can be analyzed.
Originally, I thought that here the cord continued.
Die Schnur weiterläuft. Es ist halt in dem Sinne eine spannende Stelle, weil die Schnur wirklich hier mit
But in fact, it is held here with stitching. That is fairly clear. You can see that it ends here in a coil consisting of raffia fibers. And the big question is, what sort of a function did this cord, this coil have? Was it part of a fastener for the wooden box or not?
The object from the glacier ice remains a mystery, and analysis of the CT image raises further questions, because the restorer has made a surprising discovery.
What are arrowheads doing in the direct vicinity, or actually inside the wooden box? A box which actually contained food.
Im Inneren dieser Holzschachtel, in der man eigentlich Lebensmittel gefunden hat.
Even though questions remain for archaeologists like Regula Gubler, scans like this are an important tool for finding out how our alpine ancestors might have lived.
It helps us understand what we have found there. As we suspected, there are fragments of the sides of the box. But the scan has revealed a lot more. It has shown that the cord is also inside, but knowing its position will also help us in dismantling the block. Then, if we ask the right questions, we hope to get the right answers.
Piece by piece, the researchers try to put the jigsaw puzzle together, but instead of finding answers, often they merely come across further questions.
Basically, it's detective work. You rarely find solid proof. You just keep coming across clues. In the end, you've got lots of clues and draw your final conclusion. But it is never easy. It's never about black or white. It always takes time and a lot of work. And you must never give up too quickly.
Und man darf nicht so schnell aufgeben.
Evaluating the small pieces of wood which Regula Gubler found on the Lötschen Pass is also detective work. A C14 analysis has shown that the finds are 4,000 years old, exactly the same as the Tucker box. So did all the objects belong to one and the same owner? And what about the small pieces of oak?
This is not a branch.
Ja.
It's solid wood worked from a bigger piece.
The wooden fragments reveal pressure areas. The scientists think they might have been part of a carrying frame. Every detail is important. Each wooden fragment could contain valuable information. And each piece of the jigsaw puzzle takes the researchers closer to an overall picture.
If we could now reconstruct a support frame, it would be only the second one from prehistoric times. The only one we have so far is the frame discovered with Ötzi. It shows us how people lived and how they moved around in the mountains. If we find the right fragment, we'll have a better idea of what the carrying frame looked like. So these finds still present us with many questions, which could be also answered with tiny fragments.
Even though so many questions still remain unanswered, the glacier's finds show that man used the alpine passes even in the Stone and Bronze Ages. These routes were also strategically important thousands of years later. During the Second World War, for instance, the network of ancient alpine routes was used by smugglers and also by partisans. To avoid the static entrenchment of the First World War, the Germans engaged in mobile warfare. It was only towards the end of the Second World War that the Alps played a role, when Allied bomber formations had to fly over them. Researchers have found traces of this page of history on the Umbalkes Glacier in the eastern Tyrol. In 2002, melting glacier ice freed up the wreckage of an aircraft. Apart from its 3 engines, the force of the glacier had ground the plane into small pieces. The parts are from an old U-52. For many years, the 3-engined Junkers was one of the world's most popular commercial aircraft. In the Second World War, it was used for transporting troops, casualties and bombs. It was given the trivializing nickname of Arndt-U. When France capitulated in 1940, the Nazis had occupied half of Europe. In September of that year, their Italian allies launched their Africa campaign. Initially, the German Reich was not involved.
Let's go.
16 years after the wreckage was first freed up on the Umbalkees, a team of archaeologists from Innsbruck University, headed by Thomas Bachnetzer, have set out for the glacier. The party also includes Markus Pstieler, a local mountain rescuer. He was at the scene in 2002 when the first debris from the aircraft was recovered. The hot summer of 2018 exposed more wreckage. Some of the wreckage is now quite far down the slope. It must have been blown by the wind because normally parts of the plane would be found in the glacier's direction of flow. It seems that the lighter pieces of wreckage were picked up and spread by the wind. The team want to find out exactly how the U-52 came to end up in the glacier. The region has always been full of stories about the mysterious aircraft. The team probably won't be able to secure everything, so the spot has been marked with GPS. But since they can't be up here all the time, some other parts that are bound to be lying around will inevitably be lost. Now that they have arrived at the site of the find, the team split up to search a large area of the glacier. The surface is treacherous, so they have to watch their step. Success! The team has discovered parts of the plane's fairing, along with cloth remnants, and dangerous finds which indicate what happened to the crew.
We found lots of casings from machine gun bullets. The percussion marks show that the bullets were fired. No doubt, the firing was done to attract the attention of anyone nearby. Someone who could then fetch help. But no one, it seems, heard the noise. So the crew set off down into the valley on foot.
It is known that the aircraft was not shot down, but made an emergency landing. The radio operator was seriously injured. That is why 2 other men on board attempted the dangerous descent. To find out more about the aircraft and its crew, Thomas Bachnetzer is looking for personal effects.
They all had their personal effects with them. We have found the plane itself, at least parts of it. But who flew it? And what was on board when the crew made the emergency landing? We hope to uncover some great stories.
But what mission was the plane on when it made an emergency landing in 1941? For a long time, that remained a mystery.
The whole area was immediately sealed off. Because of the emergency landing, none of the local inhabitants were allowed up the mountain. Troops then climbed to the site and, it seems, took everything of importance out of the aircraft.
So what was so special about the plane? These metal parts could be the reason for all the secrecy. Was the aircraft carrying a mysterious freight that was too heavy to remove? In the summer of 2018, the search continued. The team have found incendiaries scattered all around. That means they'll have to call in military specialists.
Ja, na unglaublich. Da müssen wir Entminungsdienst rufen oder was?
If the munitions are left here, they could well be covered over the next time snow falls. The incendiaries are filled with phosphorus, and if the detonators are still intact, the bombs could explode on contact. So they constitute a threat and need to be deactivated.
It's also mysterious. I believe they even tried to destroy the aircraft and any evidence by dropping incendiaries.
That's one theory why the aircraft was bombed after its emergency landing. But the fact is that it was totally overloaded. Two weeks after the incendiaries were discovered, a special unit of the Austrian armed forces recovered the dangerous legacy. The bombs are still highly dangerous even today. The parts from the old Junkers were taken to aircraft expert Wolfgang Falch. He and his team have spent 8 years trying to solve the mystery. They have discovered that the aircraft was transporting a radar installation which was vital to the war effort, hence all the secrecy.
The aircraft was part of Special Duty Bomber Wing 9 and was involved in preparations for the Africa campaign. At the time, January 1941, that was all top secret. The plane was on its way to Sicily to set up a Freyr station. Freyr was a ground-based early warning radar system. The reason why our Junkers 52 from the Umbalcase was so overloaded was because it was carrying not only the equipment but also the staff needed at the location.
That's why so many radio operators and technicians were on board. Taken in 1941, this photo shows some of the crew on the Glacier. On February 11, 1941, German troops landed in Africa. The Nazis needed the radar installation for monitoring Allied shipping off the coast, so the plane was on a top-secret mission. But what about the incendiaries? The wreckage of the plane was clearly visible from the air, so it was probably just a chance target for Allied bombers who then got rid of their load.
Things were constantly being dropped in the Alps, especially on return flights, and that also includes bombs. If a plane had been hit and struggled to gain altitude, its bombs would be jettisoned to make the aircraft lighter. For whatever reason, some aircraft didn't drop their bombs on cities, so they released them in the Alps to avoid having to return with an aircraft that was fully loaded.
Some 80 years after the Junkers emergency landing, researchers seem to have solved the mystery. The pilot wasn't familiar with the region and his aircraft was overloaded, hence the crash landing. Snow and a fuselage, which had been heated up by the sun, caused the plane to sink into the ice. 62 years later, it re-emerged 2 kilometers further down. An emergency landing, bombs, and pure chance. But chance can tell us a lot about what happened in the Second World War. A discovery in the Bernese Alps dates back to the same time. Today, the Zandfleuren Glacier is part of the Glacier 3000 skiing resort near Gstaad. In summer 2017, glacial melt exposed the bodies of a man and a woman. The macabre find was made by the driver of a snow groomer as he was heading back from the bottom end of the glacier.
After I had dropped off my colleague, I saw something black on the glacier. It seemed odd, so I stopped and got out to take a closer look. I found a shoe frozen in the ice and various other objects. Finally, I saw 2 bodies trapped in the glacier. It was a shock because you're not used to seeing things like that.
Ça surprend.
Accompanied by his boss, Bernard Channen, a year later, Jan have revisited the site.
C'est juste ici. Il reste encore des bouts de tissu là. Ah oui.
They found the spot and also come across some cloth remnants. There is also something else sticking out.
Ça reste comme ça encore.
Ouais, pas mal de choses là.
Ouais. Par contre, le trou là, il s'est bien rebouché. Oui. On voit plus rien.
It turns out to be a wooden button.
Là, il y a aussi quelque chose d'intéressant.
Ça ressemble à un bouton.
Un bouton en bois.
Ouais.
Once again, traces have been found. Human remains, clothing, and equipment. The men had a strong suspicion even when the initial find was made.
The colleague who was with Jan remembered the story, which was quite well known, of a man who had been out on the glacier looking for his parents. And then the head of the ski patrol team told me straight away that the bodies had been dead for a long time.
Could it have been the corpses of Francine and Marceline Dumoulin? The couple were last seen on August the 15th, 1942. Only their two daughters are still alive. They have moved back to their home village of Savieres in Valais.
Everybody liked my father. He had a beautiful voice and loved to sing. He did everything. My mother was a teacher, and when she went to work, he used to look after us little ones. He was a cobbler and had a workshop.
Francine had 7 children. On August the 15th, 1942, she and her husband wanted to attend the annual religious service on a mountain pasture in the next valley. The quickest way to get there was across the glacier.
My father knew the mountains like his back pocket. It was the first time my mother had taken the route. Before then, she had always been pregnant. 1929, 1930, 31, 32, 34, 36, 38, and 1940.
The couple set out around midday. The weather was fine, but suddenly, as often happens in the mountains, it changed.
My uncle, who was already in the Saint-Florent mountains, saw this blackness approaching. "Quick," he said, "give me the telescope so that I can see my brother one last time." It was like a dark premonition, because from one moment to the next you can't see a thing. You can't imagine how fast that happens.
The children were put in the care of various relatives. Marceline Audry Dumoulin never gave up hope of finding her parents.
What I remember when we lost our parents is that my aunt took me in her arms and began to cry. She wept and wept. Later, I made the pilgrimage to Santiago de la Compostela 5 times, praying and praying that my parents might be found, that I might see my mother and my father buried before I myself died.
Was her wish to be granted after 75 years? In 2017, the discovery of the bodies was reported to the police in Sion. 140 persons are still reported missing in the Valais Mountains alone. For identification purposes, the police keep a DNA profile in every missing person dossier. This enabled the Dumoulins to be positively identified.
Each case is a challenge, but especially this one. Every person whose body is found and can be identified is of major importance to us. That is because we can then give that person a name. It means families can then overcome their grief and lay their loved ones to rest.
Qu'elle soit ensuite, qu'elle puisse être enterrée.
For Marceline Dumoulin, a long-cherished wish has been fulfilled. The day of the funeral was not a sad day for her.
I didn't shed a single tear when I received the news and knew at last where they were. And now, at last, they are here. Before the church service, I was asked how I felt. I said that it was the happiest day of my life.
Her parents' bodies lay at an altitude of 3,000 meters for 75 years. Even when they were buried down in the valley, the story did not end for Marceline. She wanted to see where they had died. So shortly after the funeral, she visited the glacier herself.
It was very emotional when we came here with their daughter, with Marceline. She sang a song with which her mother used to sing her to sleep.
Marche, marche, marche.
March, march, happy battalion. The battalion is marching to the sound. For me, it was a miracle that my parents had been found. I was relieved. All I could think was, at last.
Enfin.
No one knows how many relics of the past are still slumbering in the eternal ice. Archaeologists are still hoping for further sensational glacier finds, because the frozen secrets show that prehistoric man was in a position to survive in the high Alps much earlier than researchers had thought possible. Scientists had long underestimated our ancestors' capabilities. Unique relics prove how brutal the icy conflict was, which took place in the Alps during the First World War at heights of up to 4,000 meters. Frosty finds from the Second World War are helping scientists to solve a mystery that is nearly 80 years old. Archaeologists are hoping to make further finds. Relics from the ice could answer many questions that are still open.